Welcome all students, parents, teachers, community leaders, school leaders, interested parties. We are so delighted you're here with us this morning. I'm Phaedra Shaltanis, and I will be the host for today's conversation. I am an instructor in history and literature, as well as logic and rhetoric at Scollay Academy, and I serve as the humanities department chair. And we have today some wonderful contributing editors for our middle and high school history lines, Humanitas and Curious Historian. But before we get to that, I would love to share with you some amazing resources available for your support and encouragement. So Scollay Academy is a partner with Classical Academic Press, and we support homeschooling families by providing live online classical Christian courses for grades K to 12. And all of the courses can be selected a la carte according to each family's needs. These courses are open for enrollment now for the 25-26 academic year, and we have so many rich and vibrant courses, almost 500 live courses. And you will find courses on the very subjects and books we will be looking at today. If you're interested, please go to scollayacademy.com/courses. I think Courtney can put that in the chat. And also, Scollay Academy offers some assistance through the Tutoring Center, and many opportunities exist there for supplemental tutoring, private course instruction, and support for students with learning differences. So take a look at that. It's scollayacademy.com/tutoring center. But that's not all. From Classical Academic Press, we have the Classical U online courses for adults, and they are recorded to take at your own pace, and they include a host of subjects and training with some incredible speakers, a very rich opportunity. You can find those courses at classicalu.com. And school leaders, you can receive a free evaluation of our platform and learn more about our branded PD training tracks if you book a consult, which would be info.classicalu.com. We can get you these links. I'm not sure if they're popping up for you, but we will certainly make them available to you today. Okay, so Classical Academic Press, the wonderful publishing company that supports our needs. We have The Curious Historian, the middle school history line, and then Humanitas. And we get to hear from two incredible contributors. I'll introduce them to you now, and then you may, they'll tell us so many wonderful things about these texts. Our first guest, Nate Antiel, is the series managing editor of Humanitas. He spent 15 years full-time in the classroom teaching primary text-based integrated humanities courses, and he currently teaches courses on pedagogy and the arts. He is at the Templeton Honors College at Eastern University, and he serves as the assistant editor of Principia, the peer-reviewed academic journal in classical ed. He holds advanced degrees from Trinity College Dublin, Yale, and Templeton, and his academic work focuses on aesthetics, theological poetics, and medical ethics. Does that not sound entrancing? And thank you, Nate, for joining us. And our next guest is Marie Campbell, and she came on board Classical Academic Press full-time a little over 3 years ago. And she is the series managing editor of The Curious Historian. She's also served as content editor of the Well-Ordered Language series and copy editor of several of CAP's monographs. Marie holds a PhD in language and literature from the University of Notre Dame, where she taught writing and literature courses. During her years as an assistant professor and lecturer, she also taught at Notre Dame College of Ohio, Monterey Peninsula College, and California State University, Monterey Bay. She launched her career in editing at the same time she began homeschooling her two sons, and now those two sons, recent college grad, and the other a sophomore in college. So these two wonderful folks are here to tell us what we can enjoy in The Curious Historian and Humanitas. And so I'd like to start by just throwing out this question. What can we expect from these books? In brief, tell us just tell us about the books. And should we start with Marie, being the middle school, and then we can go to Nate?
Thank you, Phaedra. Thank you very much. Um, so The Curious Historian is a three-level series. It's targeted toward fifth grade and up, though it's very flexible. And we are discovering that homeschool families use it across ages. So you can adjust the level according to the needs of your own family. But before we get into too many details, let me just give you the 30,000 foot perspective. Um, and the unique approach to the past that the Curious Historian takes is that it treats history as story. The chapters are narratives about historical important people, leaders, rulers, writers, inventors, as well as the important events and civilizations. But it also touches on the everyday lives of people and the more mundane events. So it tells the story of achievement throughout world history. It also tells the story of conflict and failure. It tells the story of people struggling to be wise and good, but also people succumbing to greed and destruction. Um, and in a little bit, I can show you a sample paragraph or two and how it is story. At the same time, our approach to the past is pays a lot of attention to the artifacts of the past. And so the design of the book captures, it's just very rich visually. It has many photographs of still existing monuments. It has a lot of historical artifacts that students can actually look at. And I'll show you samples of that too in a little bit. So that's sort of the approach. The underlying message to students in The Curious Historian is to tell students that you are a part of the story of history, but you are also one of the storytellers. So it teaches students to begin thinking like historians rather than just memorizing facts. So they begin to understand that the historical record is incomplete. They begin to understand that historians are people who solve puzzles, who interpret the past. And they begin to understand that while they're mining for what is good and what is bad in the past, that no particular historical figure or event can be easily categorized as either all good or all bad. And that really the fundamental purpose of studying history is to know the world better and to know yourself better. And that aligns very well with the classical tradition, which is all about cultivating virtue and wisdom in students. So that's a little bit long-winded, but that's sort of the high-level perspective of the curious historian.
Yes, well, thank you. And some beautiful and very important points of wisdom in there in terms of a person's place in the historical narrative. Thank you, Marie. And now Nate.
Yeah, thanks, Marie. That's great. And that actually kind of leads into Humanitas rather well. So, yeah, Humanitas is a 4-year curriculum that is primary text-based. So, in many ways, I would describe it as a sort of narrative history approach, except it's not a narrative that we've constructed. We've tried to recover the narrative from the actual author's understudy. So the first year's curriculum is ancient Greece and Rome. The second year is on the Middle Ages. We have books on the American experiment as well. And then the final year's worth of books that haven't come out yet, those are going to be on the early modern period. So it walks you through history that way. And the books themselves, um, everything, I mean, everything is historical, but what we've tried to do is remove the silos that have become attached to the study of history. So you get English as separate from philosophy, as separate from theology, as separate from history, as separate from politics. And what we've attempted to do is just say, what did the Greeks value? And it turns out poetry is a big part of that. So our history books on Greece have Hesiod, they have Homer, they have Sappho's poetry. We have texts by Herodotus and Thucydides. So, what did the Greeks do? What did they value? Well, they invented tragedy. So, the study of Greek history means you're going to have to encounter tragedy in some way. They cared a lot about medicine. So, you're going to read Hippocrates, where we get our version of the Hippocratic Oath from the Hippocratic Corpus. So, we have excerpts from that. There's different things related to natural philosophy, um, the sort of proto science, I guess. It's not really science, but it's what develops into science later. So then you get to the Romans and you say, well, what did the Romans value? And so we have writings that deal with education and rhetoric in particular. We've got excerpts from Vitruvius in architecture. So the Romans were magnificent engineers. So we have a text that deals with that. So it's history through their eyes. It's the story the Greeks told themselves about who they were, where they came from, and what they were proud of. So it's an attempt to move away from the traditional textbook where we say, here's what we think is valuable about the past. And it's an attempt to say, here's what the ancient Greeks and Romans thought were valuable about themselves. And we just try to present those texts to you. So it's what Marie said about trying to teach students to think like historians is exactly right. So if you look at history textbooks and you look at their works cited or their, the key figures that they talk about, the Humanitas books actually present the works cited. They actually present the writings of the important figures, as opposed to a 20 or 21st century interpretation of the significance of those events. We provide contemporary accounts of the events. I suppose the other thing I'd say about Humanitas is it is a history text, but it's actually more properly a humane letters text. So it's something that's meant to be done either together with English or alongside English. And I kind of hinted at this already, saying we have tragedy and philosophy and theology. So it's more of a humane approach to history as opposed to just what Marie said again, facts. It's not just major dates, major figures, major battles. Uh, it's much more humane than that.
Agreed. And it is tremendous. When I first saw both Humanitas and Curious Historian, it struck me just what there's no comparison between these texts and what a lot of modern history texts are producing. They're not even in the same category in so many ways because of what you just said, Nate. What do you think? How would you say you made decisions on what to include? I know it takes kind of an expert in history, although can we ever really fully be an expert? So Nate, in terms of choosing selections, you kind of referenced that already. What more do you have to say about like what was chosen to include?
Sure. Well, let me answer the easier question. You haven't been an expert at history. No, no, you cannot. I think the best experts are the ones that sort of echo Socrates, and they say, the past, as much as I've studied it and I've journeyed there in my mind and in the text that I've read, the past is a foreign land, and it is always and ever new. So I think all historical mastery is contingent and tentative, and the best scholars are the ones that say, this is what I think, but I follow where I think the evidence leads, and I'm always waiting for and excited about new evidence that suggests that I'm wrong. Great little line by T.S. Eliot where he talked about Shakespeare. He says, we might not ever be right about Shakespeare, but there are better ways to be wrong about him. I think that's a nice little way to think about how we approach charitably and humbly the study of history. So in terms of the selection, yeah, that's that's a great question. We did, as I noted, we did try to reflect the the things that the Greeks themselves valued. So just as you survey Greek history, you go, this is a massive period of history. And the Greeks are so diverse and complex. It's actually misleading to say something like the Greeks because there's little to nothing about Homer and those who came before Homer that is similar to Pericles and Athens, that is similar to the Greeks that lived during, the Roman conquest. So we say that as kind of a shortcut, and I guess I'm that's a roundabout way of me saying there's so much that we don't know. So what we've done then is we've looked at what texts throughout the classical tradition have been returned to again and again. So some of those we would call the great texts, things by Homer and Plato and Aristotle. Um, we've also looked at what figures have been written about again and again throughout the classical tradition. So Plutarch writes about Alexander the Great. So does Jonathan Swift. You know, these are figures that have perpetually come up, as Marie said earlier, either for admiration and emulation, or as warnings to say, look at what happened to this person when. So that's something. But we've also looked for interesting, accessible primary accounts of events. So we're trying to offer different perspectives on things. For instance, in our Middle Ages books, we've got two chapters that deal with theological disputes about the Eucharist. And they actually developed at the same abbey, and they were
Mm.
teacher and student. And so you go, okay, what how can we communicate to students the variety and the depth and the charitable way in which people approach these questions? And so we have two texts by Redbertus and Ratrimus that deal with the Eucharist, and that's followed by two texts that deal with the question of icons. And one is in favor of icons, and one says, nope, you've gotten icons wrong, and we shouldn't go for them. So we've put them side by side so that students can see these were live questions. Part of the temptation of history, I think, is post hoc to say, oh, naturally it happened that way. And I can point to why it happened that way and determine causes. But actually, history is incredibly contingent. And the fact that we live through our own history right now, and nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow. So pick any contemporary event, if it's economics, if it's war related, if it's politics, and you go, it's easy to impose something post hoc and say this is why it happened. But there are so many different variables. So we've tried to find engaging, interesting ways to bring students into the broader picture, whether that's of the Greco-Roman world or the medieval cosmos. And then I suppose we've tried to find things that are age appropriate. So when it comes to Plato, for instance, we're not well, Aquinas. When it comes to Aquinas, we're not putting forth the sort of Aquinas that you would deal with and wrestle with in like a graduate seminar. It's all Aquinas is difficult, but we've picked things because both myself and a lot of the contributors have experience, not only in the academy but in the high school classroom as well. So it's like, what can students do, and what is worth wrestling with? So those are some of the sort of philosophical commitments that guided our selection. Um, Not sure if I addressed what you were hoping I would, but yeah, that's a couple different ways that we approach the question.
It's just wonderful, and how fascinating and I think comforting that your example of the two different viewpoints that emerged from the same abbey, and for the reader in modern day to say, wow, look at this, there was not full agreement, and being able to utilize their own thinking skills and critical abilities. It's just fascinating. Thank you, Nate. And so we know we learn in layers, of course, and Marie, you're the curious historian, sort of lays the groundwork in many ways for Humanitas. How about what did you find in terms of people, what choices were made in terms of what to include historically?
Well, I should start answering that question by recognizing the number of people who were involved in the project. So the first three books were written by uh, a mother-son team. The son is a historian and mother was a storyteller. That's Claire Larson and Aaron Larson. And they worked closely together and wrote the Egypt book, the Greek, and much of the Roman book. But then we drew in a number of professional historians to help us. So, gosh, I should have counted again how many there were. At one point, we had, upward of 25 people working at the same time. So part of my job was to make all of that cohere. My job wasn't to be the historian. So we really have, Nate was talking about historians not agreeing. We lived that in the creation of the Curious Historian. And not only did they work through how to tell the story of world history, but they also, along the way, left all sorts of notes for teachers so that teachers themselves can engage in those debates and know where to go for their own professional development, what to read. And what they also laid bare to the students things that historians don't agree about. And in fact, if I may I share now?
Yes, yes,
I
please.
always want to go right to the book. I had talked about how um, now one moment while I get this up. I'm not sure I can talk and share it and do the apparatus of sharing at the same time. Okay. This is from level 3A, which is the early Middle Ages. And the reason I'm sharing this is it demonstrates what I've been saying about the curious historian telling history as a story. But it also demonstrates the way historians think and work, the way they dialogue with each other, the way the way they don't agree charitably, as Nate mentioned. So, will you indulge me if I read a couple of paragraphs to you? Is
Please.
that
Thank you, Marie.
appropriate? So,
Mhm.
this is the first chapter of the Middle Ages level, and it's going to bridge the previous book, which was about Rome. So the end of the world, question mark. One of the things that I think the curious historian does well is it has great headings and subheadings in the chapters. And that's really important for young students so that they can organize the information that they're getting. The year was AD 410, and many people throughout the Roman Empire were convinced that the world was ending. After all, the unthinkable had just happened. A warlord and a group of Goths had sacked Rome, looting and destroying. And in the words of the hermit and famous Bible translator Jerome, the city that had conquered the whole world has been conquered itself. Throughout the empire, things seemed to be falling apart. Emperor Honorius reportedly told the cities in Britannia to take care of their own defenses because the legions that had guarded Hadrian's Wall and the Saxon shore along what is now called the English Channel were needed elsewhere. In North Africa, the people in the city of Hippo Regius were so panicked that the bishop there, Augustine, wrote a book called City of God to reassure them that their citizenship in the kingdom of heaven, both in the present and in the afterlife, didn't depend on what happened to the kingdom of Rome on earth. Finding out that the city that poets called the Eternal City had been sacked, and that the Romans' empire without end might indeed have an expiration date, was a huge shock for many. How did the world's mightiest empire come to this point? So that's a good example of storytelling, asking the students questions that they need to think about as they're reading, and then notice what happens in this next paragraph. The story leading to the sack of Rome includes countless fascinating characters and events spread across many different regions. And after Alaric, things got even more complicated as Roman families vied for short-lived power and as more groups of warriors showed up in Roman territory. Not just Picts, Goths, and some others we've met already, but new groups of riders from Central Asia called Huns. So many different people influenced events that historians cannot agree on one easy explanation for why these events happened. In fact, there are at least 210 possible explanations that different scholars have given for why Roman power declined in Western Europe in the 5th century. We will simply summarize three of the major factors that may have shaped the decline of Rome: social and religious changes, invaders from outside the empire, and political and economic changes inside the empire. So it's not just throwing the students in the deep end. It's trying to organize this wealth of information and the way historians have approached it. And then just real quickly, the headings take up that outline that it just laid out: social and religious changes, invasions and changes in warfare, internal political changes. So We can look more closely at a chapter later if you want to see other features in the chapter. But have I answered the question, or have I gone on such a tangent?
Absolutely. And more than enough, Marie, because you just sharing those few pages, we can see so many beautiful aspects of the learning process with, like you said, the headings and the opportunity to outline and take notes, and then various maps and timelines and images from, relics that still exist today. And I think, Nate, this is the case with Humanitas as well, if I'm not mistaken, in terms having supplemental images and right. Okay. So that's just delightful that students can kind of pick and choose what they find interesting. But you made me think, Marie, so many people, I think when we start teaching history, we maybe start understanding what history really is, if we ever can. We might think, well, here's what happened. This is what we need to know. And we find comfort in that. And I'm hearing both of you say, no, that's not necessarily the case. So can you speak a little bit to teachers who are posing all these possibilities? And I'm sensing in some ways that people might feel a little bit nervous or anxious, but like, what, I have to make the judgment for myself? Do either of you have thoughts on that?
Nate, take that first. Go ahead.
Sure. Well, thinking about a few things. I didn't know you were going to share that bit. So while you were sharing that, I went, oh, and I pulled up a couple chapters about the fall of Rome, including Augustine's City of God. So maybe that's an entree into it, actually. We have, well, here, let me share my screen real quickly.
That would be great.
I will attempt to talk towards a tentative answer to the question. So this is chapter 49. So it's the penultimate chapter of the study of Rome. So that would be like second semester of the year where you do Greece and Rome. And it's about Alaric the Goth and the sack of Rome that happens in 410. And it's told by Zosimus. So he's not an exact contemporary. He's writing about a century afterward. This comes from his new history. But yes, you see, one of the things that we've done in Humanitas is a lot of art history. So we have documents, coins, artifacts that come from the period, but we also have art that is about the period. So we have here, for instance, this is I think it's a pre-Raphaelite piece, if not, it's from the Romantic period. But it's a setting of Honorius as he feeds his pigeons while he's told that Rome is being sacked, Rome is burning. So this presents a very different interpretation of the fall of Rome and than Augustine does. So this comes at the tail end of our study of Rome, and you go, okay, what did non-Christian Romans think about the fall of Rome? And it turns out they blame the Christians. Well, you get to Augustine, and this is chapter 3 then of our study of the Middle Ages. And you have this one event, the fall of Rome in 410, and we cover it from the Roman perspective in our study of Rome, and then we cover it from what will come to be the sort of Christian medieval understanding of the same event from a very different perspective. So we've got an account here that says what Marie already said, essentially. The city of man and the city of God are distinct. You're a true citizen of the city of God, and so you need not despair when the city of men falls. And this is more complicated in the moment because Rome and the church are so interwoven, right? Remember the Council of Nicaea, and Christianity becomes the official religion of the late Roman Empire. And so the fall of the polis or the civitas is understood in a certain way to be the death knell of Christianity. And that's what Augustine is wrestling with. So here, what we did in the Middle Ages, this is from chapter 3 of our early Middle Ages book, we actually sourced historical maps. So it's just another way of bringing students imaginatively into the past. And you go, the way that even you think of the globe is very different than how people historically have conceived of it. So and we have illuminated letters here, which is really fun. A bishop Georgia, the city of God we speak of. So here, Augustine becomes the teacher. Maybe that's the best way to say it. Um, let me just try to drive that home. Uh, I'm not the teacher. Augustine becomes the teacher. And that liberates me from having to adjudicate on everything. That liberates me from having to tell students, this is what history means. Part of the study of history is coming to terms with what we think other people mean. So I think the best teachers present the text and then do their best to recede. So when I teach Zosimus, I try to defend him and I try to say, why is he arguing this? Where does the argument come from? Like, what are the principles on which it's based, and what sort of like actual moments in the text do we see that this is a logical argument? Whether or not you agree with his analysis, we need to first understand what the analysis is. That's the primary task of the historian. So then when we get to Augustine, even if I'm not a believer, I'm going to defend Augustine's perspective in the classroom because I want the students to wrestle sincerely with the past, and that means that you have to take it seriously. Um, so, what does Augustine have to teach us? And it turns out Augustine is a lot bigger than I am. Like his ideas and his thoughts are more capacious than mine are, and certainly than the students are. So one of the temptations I think that a lot of teachers who are new to teaching primary text and a lot of teachers who are eager to move away from traditional textbooks unintentionally bring over from what traditional textbooks have taught you is that you can master everything.
Mhm.
Humanitas is so very helpful because you go, well, mastery isn't the goal. Like, if you're afraid that there's more in the chapter on Augustine than you can cover, like, yes, there is. There absolutely is. And that's not a bad thing. That's a wonderful thing because it's the end of T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, right? We shall not cease from exploration. You can read this text for your entire life, and scholars and academics and theologians have, and they still wrestle with what's going on in it. And that's valuable. That's super valuable. That doesn't mean that you're failing to understand history. That means that you're coming to learn to think like a historian, that you're humbling yourself before Augustine and recognizing that his text is indeed a great text. And one of the things that makes texts great is that they're inexhaustible. It's that
Mhm.
it's that they exceed us. There's a reason why people continue to read and write about Shakespeare, but things that are only valuable because they present a moral, nobody rereads them. You know, you get everything that you can out of it, and then you move on. So I guess what I would try to say is I would encourage teachers to say you don't have to know, and you shouldn't presume to try to demonstrate to your students that you do know. Part of what's really valuable in the classroom is the way that teachers model humility, intellectual charity, and an ability to set before a text and say, the goal isn't to come to mastery of it. The goal is to improve at my ability to do this. So if I understand 2% of Augustine at the beginning and I understand 2.5% of Augustine at the end, then that's a magnificent thing. And it's a pursuit that's worth its own, it's worthwhile, and it's something that's valuable for its own sake.
Beautifully said. I feel that we should sit and think on that a bit. And we'll go to Marie next if you have anything to add.
Well, I do, and I see Rachel's question too, which is a really good one. She says, "I see how allowing Augustine to be the teacher makes sense with Humanitas. How would you answer the question teaching from Curious Historian, which does not pull from large readings of primary text?" And Nate is also describing a teacher-student relationship, which is more with a more mature student than what the Curious Historian is targeted toward. So you're teaching children, you're teaching them historical narrative as opposed to primary sources. So what do you do? I kept thinking when Nate was speaking about the way the clerk is described in the Canterbury Tales.
Mm.
You know what I'm saying? Thinking of Nate? His Chaucer describes him as gladly would he learn and gladly would he teach. I might have mixed those up. It might be gladly would he teach or gladly would he learn. That's the curious historian teacher. Gladly should you teach your children and your students. Gladly should you learn right along next to them. This is a pedagogy of engagement. It's conceivable. I'd be curious to know if most of our audience is homeschoolers. So I would welcome people to enter into the chat what sort of teacher they are, what how they're coming at this webinar, what level their students at. That it would be good to know that. Uh, but I know when I was homeschooling, I learned a lot of the material at the same time my sons were learning it. And that was the beauty of homeschooling. That's what made it alive. That's what made our discussions around the dinner table so invigorating. Um, this pedagogy of engagement means that you're going to be reading it with your students in the best case scenario. It's conceivable that you would hand a student The Curious Historian and say, read this chapter and then we'll talk about it. It would work. But it would work even better if you're reading it along with them, maybe reading it aloud, because that's when it really comes alive. And that's when a student can understand perhaps vocabulary that's unfamiliar because they're hearing it in context. That's when a discussion happens in the moment. You pause after a paragraph and you talk about it. And the Curious Historian helps with that because it has discussions, questions interspersed in the sidebars.
Mhm.
So that, if you can just stop a second and say, hey, this sounds familiar. It resonates with what we read, in level one, and talk about it. So, you don't have to know everything. You don't have to know anything. You can be at the same level as your student and grow with them. And then the Curious Historian gives you all sorts of things that is not in the student edition. The teacher's edition is thick and robust and has a lot of background material for you and material for further research if you want to do more. It also has a lot of just practical tips for how to teach the chapters. So Rachel, I hope that answers your question. Let me know if you have a follow-up.
Yes, thank you, Marie. I love the idea of learning alongside because we're always learning. That's the vision we want to cast for our students and for ourselves. And both of these texts, the Curious Historian and Humanitas, make it so they're so inviting. And many of us would just love to sit in front of the books all day long and just dig in deep. And the reality is we can't do that. So can both of you speak a little bit to parents, teachers, even students who might look at this vast amount and think, I'm never going to, quote, get through it. How would they approach? Maybe we start with you, Marie, because you'll lead into the Humanitas. How do they decide with all the richness available?
It's like, I think the first person who used this metaphor for the Curious Historian was Chris Perrin, who is the CAP publisher. He said it's a smorgasbord. And it is, imagine taking your students on a field trip to a smorgasbord. Are you going to have them gorge themselves and eat everything that's available and eat large quantities of it? No, you're going to have them focus. You might have to say, eat your protein first, and then, then maybe we'll have some dessert after that. So that's a good way to approach the Curious Historian because it really does, like many CAP products, it provides much more than what can possibly be covered in the classroom or in the homeschool. And that's a good thing. That gives you flexibility. For the curious historian, I would recommend that you prioritize the narrative. And then as you're reading the narrative with your students or assigning it to them, then pick and choose the supplemental materials according to their needs, according to their questions, kind of let them guide you, uh, or according to what dovetails nicely with other subjects that you're working on. So I maybe after Nate gives his bits of wisdom on this question, I can show you in a chapter what is primary and what is supplemental, and sort of demonstrate how you might work your way through it and make choices.
That would be great. Thank you, Marie. And Nate, what do you recommend?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I might have talked myself away from answering it. I was attempting to move in this direction before. I think this is one of the pernicious things about having been brought up with textbooks as you go. Um, what's the goal? To cover the material. And and traditional history textbooks present material that can be covered, uh, mostly because the AP curriculum and the AP test for like American history, for instance, has defined what the material is. And so there's little to no reason to spend time wrestling with like Federalist 10 and thinking about faction. You just memorize the names of the authors, the dates, what the anti-federalist papers are, and then you move on. But one of the questions, so I do this with high school students, but I do this with the teachers that I teach as well. In the MAT program at Templeton, I teach a course called Reading and the Formation of the Soul. And
Mm.
one of the questions that comes up throughout that course is just why do we read? And I do not think that we read in order to finish.
Hmm.
I think that we read in order to we read in order to understand. We read in order to discover who we are. We read in order to change, but we certainly do not read in order to finish. So if I have students who are sitting down to read Thoreau at 11 p.m., I would say, go to bed.
Yeah.
Like I would rather you read 2 pages well and understand those 2 pages of Walden than you finish Where I Lived and What I Lived For and not understand it at all. We do not read to finish. So that being said, when you look at Humanitas, I think there's a few things to keep in mind. One, there's 100 chapters, and most states have roughly 170 to 185 days of instruction. So right off the bat, you go, okay, that's roughly 2 days a chapter. But then look at the table of contents. So are you teaching a straight history course? Are you teaching a human letters course? Are you working with an English teacher? If you're working with an English teacher, you might say, I'm not going to teach 3 chapters on tragedy. You can do that in your course. I'm not going to teach Sappho. I'm not going to teach Hesiod, 2 chapters, Homer. So it's really not 50 chapters that you have to cover to begin with. But then there are all sorts of things pedagogically that you can do in class. So you can it is it one of the things that teachers, sometimes humanities teachers and English teachers, are especially guilty of this. I say that having taught English for a long time. One of the things that English teachers are especially guilty of is not using class time to read aloud.
Mm.
It is a it is a gift to students to
Hmm.
spend time reading aloud in class. So the last time I was teaching full time in the classroom, I assigned Maya Antonia, one of Marie's favorite authors, Willa Cather, mine as well. Um, and I said, I want you to bring it, and we're gonna set, and I'll put some classical music on that I want to introduce you to, and you're just gonna read for an hour and 15 minutes. That was how we had 75-minute classes. I said, I just want you to read. And they go, are there quizzes? And I said, no. Test, is there an essay? No. And they're like, well, why would we read it then? And I said, because it's beautiful and because it's just worth reading. And I had probably 40 students out of the 70 that I were teaching that year come up to me afterwards and say, you know, I don't know when the last time I would just like sat and read for over an hour uninterrupted because the TV, because the computer, because my phone is lighting up. Thank you for that. And I had a bunch of students say that was just my favorite thing that I've ever read. So one of the things that you can do in class is actually just work through a chapter aloud. So as you survey the table of contents and you identify, here's 8 or 12 or 15 chapters out of the 50 that will be covered in the English class, or that will do sort of collaboratively, then you go, here's another 5 chapters that I think this is really important. I think this is really difficult, or I think this is covered in another text, and so this is like a review opportunity. I'm going to identify those. I'm going to say we're just going to read them aloud together in class. And that's a
Mm.
super valuable use of class time. And you get to do what Marie was speaking to. You get to demonstrate how to ask questions
Mm.
text. So you read it aloud and you slow down and you ask the seminar question. So those are a few things that you can do. You can assign, well, I mentioned tragedy. So in the Greek table of contents, we've got each of the great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, are represented. So you could also do something where you go, okay, what if we gave students one of those 3 chapters? And like they can read all 3, but they're going to be responsible for talking about what makes it tragic in, like, how does tragedy in Aeschylus differ from tragedy in Euripides? It's actually profoundly different. And so there's all sorts of things you can do like that. And you can have students account for different chapters and come together. Because remember, the goal isn't to finish, the goal isn't to get through the material. The goal is to encourage the students to fall in love with Greece and Rome. The goal is by the end of the year for the students to look at Humanitas and say, I want to read more of that. Like,
Mm.
I fell in love with Euripides's play. What else did he write? And if you have a student who wants to and is willing to go back to the historical texts, the documents, the literature and the philosophy, and they say, I want more of that, then yeah, I would count that a great success. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you got through 75 chapters or 95 chapters. What matters is that there has begun to be a transformation in the soul of the student, and that they are becoming who they are. That's what matters.
Oh my goodness, Nate, that is so profound. And thank you so much for saying that. I appreciate it tremendously. I think, and maybe it sounds like you would agree that teachers and students need to be able to trust themselves to say, I just want to sit and linger over this idea. And going back to Chris Perrin's smorgasbord idea, I see this in both texts, that everything presented is worthwhile. So you can't take it all in, but the we don't need to be anxious about that, because whatever we do get will be beneficial. So thank you so much, Nate. We do have some um, challenges with the modern student. That idea of we got to get through it. Is there going to be a quiz? Marie, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think that's the great anxiety of being a homeschool teacher, is that, the fear of missing out is your worst enemy. Miss out, go deep instead of trying to cover. And it's this similar challenge for classroom teachers who are also, following the guidelines of their schools. So uh, let me share the smorgasbord. Let me share a chapter, and we'll look at one smorgasbord table. I can say that smorgasbord table, and I can sort of guide you how I would teach this if I were teaching it. But keep in mind that it's the needs of your students that are primary.
Mhm.
Okay, so you should be seeing in 2-page view the same chapter that I was reading from before. This is the first chapter in the first book on the Middle Ages. These chapters are designed to be taught in a week, and that's how a book can be covered in a semester. Um, but it's perfectly legitimate to take 2 weeks per chapter and do one book per year instead of one book per semester. But I know we have one classroom teacher in the chat asking questions, and she's probably going to need to move at a chapter a week. So here's how you do that. Every chapter begins with a timeline. This is a small version of a timeline. Each unit has a beautiful larger, more image-laden timeline, which I can show you in a little bit. This is the timeline that covers the material that's in this chapter. There is a section at the beginning of each chapter that's called memory work. These are the vocabulary terms that we recommend students memorize, if not word for word, at least memorize to know what the meanings are. And usually there's a third category here in addition to important words and important figures called important highlights, which just helps them sort of divide the terms that they're learning. This is the teacher's edition, so some things on the page are not in the student edition. These little lettered icons alert the teacher that in the teacher's pages at the end of each chapter, there's a note for them. There are songs that accompany the Curious Historian, and so we give these reminders to people. Don't forget, there's a weak song that you can learn. That's also part of the memory work. Are you going to have your students memorize these things? We hope so. But if you want to approach it differently, approach it differently. Maybe you don't want to actually have them memorize the songs, but just play them in the background. Or if you're a family, you might pop them in the car when you're traveling somewhere. What I would recommend on the first day that you teach this chapter, that you first review the songs that you've already mastered. You also introduce the chapter topic. You will have previewed it as the teacher. You let the students listen to new song verses. You introduce them to the new vocabulary terms. You identify how the terms might resonate with what's not in the timeline. So you just really kind of deal with the first page of the chapter on the first day. You might not even begin reading, but maybe you do. Maybe you start reading the chapter, read the first section or so. On day 2, I would recommend that you read at least a third of the chapter together out loud. Again, don't have to read it out loud if that doesn't suit the needs of your students, but that's the recommendation. You might read it to them. You might have them take turns, paragraph by paragraph, reading. You might have them read silently and then talk about it. As you work your way through the chapter, you'll see these beautiful images that are as much as possible from the period, but some of them are like this is a modern illustration on the left side of the page. You'll begin to see particular sidebars. This one is only in the teacher's edition. I hope it's large enough that you can see it. It says if you purchase the Curious Historian's Archive Extra Resources for Level 3A, you can explore through the Biblical Connections PDF. The Curious Historian is accompanied by Biblical Connections. These books are Christian friendly, but they're perfectly suitable for secular schools. So if you are a Christian school or a Christian family and you really want to do more with biblical content, each book has biblical connections. In the early books, those biblical connections are very particular and historical. When we are discussing in the book, we alert you to where you can find in the Bible. As you get into the Middle Ages, there aren't specific biblical connections, but there are biblical parallels. And so those are pointed out in biblical connections. Do you have time for that? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Are you interested in that? Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. But it's there if you want it. Another kind of sidebar is history bits, and that's in the student edition, and the icon is a little puzzle, like a bit. And often this is not, in fact, almost always, it's not new material. It's alerting the students to connections, or it is digesting the wealth of the chapter into bullet points. So that it's just, helping them organize the information. This particular one is pointing out how what we're discussing in this chapter is happening at the same time things that have been discussed in other chapters are happening. Okay, let me show you other sidebars. Here's one of those question boxes I mentioned, Decline of Empire. So you're reading along with your students and you can pause and say, if you studied ancient history with us in level 1, can you remember any of the changes that added up to bring about the collapse of the late Bronze Age world? So we're asking them to make a connection between the collapse of the Roman Empire and the collapse of the Bronze Age world. If you haven't done level 1, then skip that. Um, Here's an example of the beautiful maps that are in the Curious Historian. Nate pointed out that period maps are used in Humanitas. We have a wonderful designer named Bill Wiest who has designed our maps for us under the guidance of the historians who wrote the book. And so here's an example where students can, on facing pages, compare the Eastern Roman Empire at different stages of its development. So you could take time and just study that out. The maps reappear in the unit reviews as blank maps that students can fill in. Let's see, what else do we have to, oh, this is one of my favorite sidebars. This is these notebook pages. They look like they're ripped from a notebook. Our notebook writer is fictional. His name is Archibald Diggs. He is an archaeologist, and his initials are AD. And he enabled the writers of the book to do some of the fun stuff that they want to do, but can't quite get into the main narrative without it being a distraction. So in this case, they really wanted Archibald to tell the students about a parrot. The uh, Egyptian historian and diplomat had a parrot with him his whole life. So that's very interesting to children. And then here's another sidebar. This is a short of the age piece. We call these cultural pieces that are interspersed through the entire series. Literature of the Age is this one. We also have Monuments of the Age, our Fashion of the Age, Literature of the Age, all sorts of the age pieces. They are cultural asides. This one focuses on Augustine. But again, this is something that you could cover in the classroom, or that you could have students do on their own, or you could just kind of gracefully skip over, and interested students will go back to them on their own. So those are extras. There's another history, but here's another sidebar, to the source, where we just layer in the Latin etymologies, sometimes Greek etymologies. When we get into the Eastern chapters, sometimes more complex etymologies of words, and that helps students make sense of what they're learning in their Latin classes or English classes, and how it relates to some of the vocabulary they're encountering here. Here's another of the age, technologies of the age, the codex, and we have beautiful pictures of that. And then another supplemental is the digital piece called Profiles and Legends. This is also part of the Curious Historians archive that is accessible through my library on Classical Academic Press's website. And this is where our writers have placed interesting profiles about figures that the students are reading about in the chapters, but we haven't been able to go in depth with them. And it's also where students can encounter the myths and legends of history that aren't considered historical fact. So you're working your way through this. I would take at least 3 days to read a chapter. And then and as you're doing that, you're also tackling some of the exercises that are at the end of each chapter. Here for the older students, we have a writing exercise. We have a discussion exercise. We have identifications and more factual things to help them remember what they've read. You can be having them do those as they're reading the chapter, or you can hold them for the end. By the way, there are also quizzes for each chapter. And then on the 5th day of your week, you catch up, you complete any objectives that you as the teacher had for this chapter, you assess using the quiz or the exercises or discussion, and then you supplement with some of the other digital resources that we offer. So I hope that helps and isn't just a bunch of noise, but the chapters are flexible is the main point.
That's excellent to hear. Thank you, Marie, for showing us too that students are learning how to read, how to organize information through those activities that supplemental. I mean, anything. I love what both Marie and Nate, you've said that these programs sort of empower the teacher and the student and pose a restful approach to learning. Nate, what can you add to in terms of Humanitas, which different format? I don't even know what the original question was anymore, but we are have 25 minutes remaining, and I want to make sure we get to everything you both want to say about your program.
Oh,
Hmm.
yeah, I don't know that there's. Let me think about that in the background,
Okay.
if there's something else. I suppose the one thing that I might mention, it's different, but kind of an analog to what Marie was showing, is just our teacher guides. So we don't have teacher editions because the text like Grease Book One, Grease Book Two are primary texts. I showed that earlier. There's an introduction, timelines, occasional maps, and other features, a lot of beautiful art and captions, uh, questions for discussion and writing. But the teacher guide, let me share my screen here. This is something I'm really proud of. Uh, This is the teacher guide for Greece. This is written by a colleague of mine, Nathaniel McGarry. We taught together for ooh, better part of a decade. I don't know, 7 to 10 years, somewhere in there. Um, but for folks that are less familiar with classical pedagogy, for folks that are less familiar with primary text, and even even for people who have been around the block a few times, I think that this is just a treasure trove, a wealth of value and information here. So we opened the teacher guide. We sort of co-wrote. Nathaniel was the lead author here. We co-wrote a sort of primer on pedagogy related to primary texts. So this is incredibly useful. It covers a number of the things that I've talked about or talked toward, I suppose, including a section on how to spend time in class, a section on the different ways that you can assess students, covering like assessing seminar and discussion through the different types of essays that you can assign and how to think about them and grade them. We also have curated lists of poems and music.
Hmm.
So things that you can begin bringing into the classroom. We recommend that you start every day with a poetry recitation, that you actually learn poetry by saying poetry. And then each of the 50 chapters has a sort of, we called them lesson plans. That sounds a bit more prescriptive than I would probably phrase it. But it's maybe a way into that chapter. And I think one of the things that classical teachers hopefully are learning to do as they're teaching primary text is hold their plans loosely. So students will often come in with a question that is phenomenal, that is totally different than what you had planned, prepped. And there's something about remembering that you're teaching students. You're not teaching Augustine, you're teaching students. And so some of that means having a willingness to say, okay, that's a good and valid question, and we're going to pursue that, even though that's not what I prepared at all. So this presents one way to get in. This is on Hesiod, so there's a really helpful critique here at the beginning of the way in which myth is approached by most people. Myth means false.
Mhm.
So we're trying to recapture what myth was for the Greeks. For the warm up, then this is just a way to begin class, and sometimes we'll include a couple ideas. Different warm-ups will sometimes include things like a picture study. So if there's a piece of art from the chapter that we want to say, let's spend 5 to 10 minutes learning to look at art and to learn how to allow a piece of art to disclose itself to the viewer. This one, the warm-up is by actually chanting the first 50 to 150 lines of Homer aloud to give a sense. This is what James Taylor calls poetic knowledge, a poetic experience, to give a sense of like, what would it be like to have heard, remembering that Homer wasn't written, it was recited, right? So it was chanted, it was sung. So that's a way into the lesson, and it often connects to the discussion questions then. So these are really well crafted by master teachers, and a lot of time and effort went into the questions for discussion and writing. But probably 2/3 of these are proper seminar questions that you could spend an entire class on. So one of the things that teachers can do then, and that students should do, in addition to using these as writing prompts, you can read through them and say, oh wow, question about Homer and fate, we could talk about that for 3 weeks. That's what we're gonna do. And so you prep in light of that Socratic question. A conclusion kind of brings things back together. And then we have teacher tips, sometimes that probe things like particular questions. Regarding question 9, it's important to remember this. And some of them are going to be things that are glosses, like important glosses, especially when we get into something like philosophy. Here's some technical language. And so if you need a more didactic, here's the difference between essence and accidents in Aristotelian philosophy, then there's well articulated approaches to those things. And we also end with further reading. So if you're interested in pursuing different things that are raised in the teacher guide, it's just it's a really great resource because it connects you to things that can help you go a lot further. Let me see if I should have prepared. I'm sorry, I didn't prepare.
No, this is excellent. So helpful to see how these texts are formatted. And I really appreciate, even you had mentioned, Nate, that the lesson plan not being something that must be followed, but I think it does comfort teachers to say, okay, I don't have to decide that here's a guide to help me sort of walk through this.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So here, and often you'll find that a well-crafted warm-up will just have momentum that carries you through the rest of the period anyway. So here's a warm-up where we actually start with the Laocoon. So here's an art piece. Sometimes, oh, I skipped over it. Well, there's an art piece and there's directed questions, and we've sort of fleshed out how do you teach students to set in front of a piece and probe it, and a lot of that is just observing. Students and teachers are eager to interpret or impose like meaning, and it's like no, meaning is something that comes out of careful attention to detail. So like first, how many figures are there? How are they positioned? What colors are they wearing? Describe the clothes. Ah, luxurious. Okay, so now we can begin talking about wealth or something like that. Some of the warm-ups, I skipped over it, but for one of the chapters on Hesiod with Gaia and Uranus, we open with Holst's planets. So actually listening to, I think it was like 6 minutes of the symphony, and then putting that in conversation with, in what way is this like Hesiod's Uranus, or in what way is it a critique of that? So those are different warm-ups and exercises. So I guess that's the other piece. I think it's a tremendous value. I think we should be selling the teacher guide for a lot more than we are. But it's very affordable. I think it's going to be really helpful to people that are interested in transforming the classroom into like a proper humane letters course where you're doing poetry and art and music, English and history all together. So that would be the one other thing I suppose that I need to kind of make sure people are aware of, because if you're just looking at the books, you might not have that pushed or advertised or explained. So I think it's a really wonderful resource.
The Curious Historian has a tremendous value attached to it too. If I can share my screen again, this is what you see if you are on the My Library page for the Curious Historian. Whoops, I gotta hit share, don't I? There. So this is for the last book in the series, and the Curious Historian's archive costs extra, but you only need to purchase one. If you're using the books in the classroom, you only need one of these for the teacher, and you can download and distribute much of this material. And so this is where you would find the profiles and legends that I mentioned before, biblical connections that I mentioned before. I did not mention the reading guide, which is a list of a curated list of extra reading for you and for your students, and it's divided accordingly, according to themes and according to age levels. And then all the rest of this material is from the book, but in a printable form. So each book contains at the end the top 12 things to remember from the whole book. Well, here's a printable version that you can display in your classroom. The other thing that each level includes is an event day. And so let me just switch you over to this is the Medieval Day event. And one of the questions in the chat was about how to teach these books in a co-op. This is so made for an entire co-op semester. You could divide a day's event across a semester and do one activity a week. Or you could use the textbooks just like they're intended for classrooms or for homeschool classrooms, and then end with a day's event that involves the entire co-op and not just the single class. So we have an Egypt Day event for level one, a Rome Day event for level two, and this Medieval Day event. And these resource guides are tremendous because they tell you you don't have to remember anything. It's got everything you would possibly need. An overview of what's happening, a schedule for the day, how you can involve parents and volunteers, how you set the scene. This Medieval Day event has a castle area, a monastery area, medieval feast in the middle of the day, a cathedral area. So these are all extra. They're not something that is required to do, but one of the things that's offered in the smorgasbord that I think you would particularly enjoy. So these Curious Historian archives do cost extra, but again, a tremendous value. What doesn't cost extra are the bonus digital resources. If you purchase your book on classicalacademicpress.com, these bonus digital resources are complimentary. If you purchase through Amazon or another source, then they cost, but it's just a minimal cost. So I think you'll find these a good value too. This is, printable versions of the quizzes and also answers for you. And then there are support resources that are free for everyone. Go Deeper is a long list of online sources that you can go to complement what you're reading in the book. So if you are reading about an archaeological, or you're reading about a monument, you can go to an online source that shows you the archaeological dig, that sort of thing.
Wow, so exciting. What gorgeous things you have shown us, both of you, with the text. I wonder if we have time to just, I wanted to ask a question because it comes up a great deal in humanities, is how to deal with assessment. Marie had mentioned quizzes, but Nate, I wonder if you could expound a little bit on that. If you have just kind of a quick tip even, or how should we look at assessment with Humanitas?
Yeah, the quick is what makes it challenging.
Right, I understand.
Yeah, so I think there, why are you assessing is a question that has to be asked. And unfortunately, in a lot of school systems, even classical ones, the answer is so that you have something in the grade book.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really terrible reason to assess. So I I don't believe in reading quizzes for a number of reasons. Um, Especially just like this is what I was used to in high school and even in college as an English major, I would often get little reading quizzes, and they were purportedly checks to make sure that you had done the reading. I
Mhm.
find it much more effective to just ask students, have you read? And it doesn't take much to learn if they're telling the truth or not if you engage them in conversation. But the kind of reading quizzes that I have seen crafted and put forward tend to be about minor details, and they're just like, can you catch out a student, and like Does it really matter? That's the thing.
Hmm.
There's a question about what was it? Oh, like what lake? And you go, does the name of the lake really matter?
Right, right.
It's not it's not insignificant, but like if you're discussing a story by Flannery O'Connor, like isn't it, shouldn't we be thinking about like what fate is? Like what does knowing the name of the school that the girls went to, what does that matter? And the answer is it probably doesn't. It's a less important thing. So in terms of assessment, I think what you're assessing is student improvement. I think what you're assessing is part of it's hard. Let's do it this way. You have the intellectual virtues and then you have the moral virtues. I think we need to be careful as teachers in the classroom, not to not to try to assess the moral virtues. I don't think that's really the right role of the teacher. There can and should be moral development, but that's something internal to the soul, and that's something very personal to the student. So you actually risk preventing that kind of inward growth from happening if you're asking students to reflect on those things aloud and in a performative way and in front of their peers. And remember, I'm thinking about older students. So how do you assess student improvement? There's some memory work I think is always valuable. Uh,
Mhm.
Augustine's meditation on memory is really lovely and what the memory is and how it relates to who you are. And so stalking the memory is an important thing. So I think introducing students to poems, if you follow the teacher guides for Humanitas, your students will be learning and not forgetting
Mhm.
between 4 and 8 poems a year. So over the course of 4 years, that's a lot. Same thing with art, same thing with music. You can assign writing, and you can assign verbal or oral presentations. The other thing that you're assessing, I think, is conversation. So
Mhm.
this is something that's really, really difficult. I mean, etymologically, conversa, it means to turn with. It's a sort of dance. Um, Learning how to listen to the person in front of you and
Mhm.
respond, like actually hear what they say and respond to that. So a lot of that assessment involves one-on-one coaching. So you talk with a student afterward and you say, so this is an acquired skill that it takes a while to develop, but you go, okay, you said 3 things today, all of them were to this person and all of them were critical. And they probably don't know that.
Mhm.
Thinking of sports, the difference between playing soccer and then coaching soccer is super profound. And so you play and you're following what's happening, but you coach and you go, okay, my defense just cleared the ball. And instead of watching the ball go forward, I actually look in the opposite direction and I like tell my goalie, move your line up. And then I'm checking the clock and I'm like, okay, these 3 kids haven't played yet. I have to get them in. There's so much to manage. So when you're teaching and you're thinking about coaching conversation and assessing participation in seminar, not only do you have to keep track of the content, but you also have to keep track of the social dynamic, who's speaking, who isn't, who said one thing that led to 20 minutes of like profound conversation, as opposed to who said 20 things but didn't contribute anything. And all of those require a different sort of um, one-on-one interaction. But you need to, as a teacher, what you need to do is block out certain moments in the year. And you go, let me do an assessment of how this student is doing. And I need to write that down and come back to it 6 weeks later and say, there's been no development or no growth, or I've noticed profound growth. The other thing that just makes this complicated is oftentimes there's stuff in the life of the student that you're unaware of. And you need to make sure that you're assessing what you see and not unintentionally like imposing reasons for what you see. So a student that doesn't speak, that does not mean that they didn't read necessarily. It does not mean that they do not care. There might be something very awful happening outside of the classroom that has affected their performance. So you also need to be careful not to make too much of too little. And that's something that comes with like acquired prudence in the classroom. And then there's essays. So I would assign different types of essays depending on the year. So seniors should be writing more analytical essays where they're explaining. So let's see, freshmen would write more like example essays. And so you're using the text to say, here's a thing that Plato cares about. And you find 3 examples of that and you write about it, 5 examples of it. So seniors then are going to be writing more analytical essays, and it's more what's the significance of this thing in Plato's thought, or not you're not trying to an example essay on Huckleberry Finn, Huck and Jim become friends as that's a poor thesis. Huck and Jim discover the nature of love, right? And then you could even qualify the type of love. That's a much better thesis. But then the senior, what is love, right? So you're actually probing the text and you're trying to construct an argument in that way. I think one of the things that we don't do is allow students to rewrite as much as we ought to. And I mean that in a couple ways. So you could assign the exact same essay for your first essay and your final essay, and you can set them side by side and say, I can literally see demonstrated growth. You can give a paper back to students and say, great, I want you to rewrite it. You should keep every paper that your students write, and before you assign a next one, make them reread not only what they wrote before, but your critique and assessment of it. So you say, 3 essays in a row now, I have told you that you're looking at surface level for this, and I've encouraged you to do something different. What's the issue? Are you forgetting? Did I not make that clear? Can we? And you can sit down with students and have them clear theses with you before writing a paper. So you can say, no, that falls into the same issue that you've had on your last 3 papers. So those are a couple different things. Poetry recitation, Socratic seminar, and coaching students on how to interact charitably with their peers, with the text, with you as the teacher, and then different types of essays. There's also all sorts of like imitation exercises that you can do. So we've read through some Chaucer, and now I want you to try to adopt Chaucer's syntax and diction and write a similar story about don't pick a teacher. Don't write about another teacher. Right. But like you can have them do those kinds of exercises. So those are kind of like pillars for what I would do at the upper levels, and it can get a lot more nuanced and things. But this is, you said quick, and I tried.
Oh, that was wonderful. Nate, thank you. Excellent ideas. Marie?
Just I can be briefer because I think what Nate said was wonderful. I don't have a lot to add. But for younger children, we do have quizzes, and those are, if you need to show grades in a grade book, the quizzes are perfect for that. And they're fair quizzes. They're not the kinds of quizzes that Nate described hating about, the name of the lake. They are fair quizzes. And there aren't any surprises in them. They're very similar to the exercises. Every chapter also has a creative activity. And I think that part of assessment should be celebration of what you've gained at the end of each chapter. And sometimes those creative activities are the best way to just celebrate that, oh yeah, I'm making cuneiform on this clay tablet. I know what that means. And it might not look exactly like the originals did, but like I'm actually doing it. I think that's terrific assessment. And we also have a whole layer that I haven't addressed at all on which we call Spotlight on Virtue. Every chapter has a discussion question that's itself paragraphs long that addresses a virtue that you could discuss in relation to the historical figures and events. And those discussion questions are meant to be discussion, but you could use those as writing prompts as well. And that would be a very interesting way to assess. The quizzes also, you could take a single question out of one of the quizzes and turn it into a writing prompt. So there, again, there's a lot of flexibility in the way you would assess.
Absolutely. And there's no end to possibilities for both of these, Humanitas and the Curious Historian, reading, learning, growing endlessly. And how wonderful that you both have helped make these resources available to us as homeschoolers, as teachers, as students ourselves. Thank you so much. I think we are about out of time. So I think I will say, all of you who joined us, thank you so much. I hope you get your hands on these amazing books at some point soon and enjoy the study. Thank you all.
Thank you.